Okay, so I'm going to talk about education for decolonization in the context of Kahnawà. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this because, I mean, having grown up in Kahnawà and gone through the schooling there and everything like that, it really offered me a chance to kind of reflect on what we've done in Kahnawà and the lessons learned and things that we can share and offer to other communities. Because I think Kahnawà has always been at the forefront of kind of pushing boundaries, whether it's in the political realm and governance or in other areas too. And so oftentimes people don't know, though, the work that goes into creating that energy and creating the advancements that the community has made, and also the prices that have been paid by the people in the community for taking those stances. And so this is an opportunity to focus on an area which, because of the work that I've done in oral history, I'm doing an oral history project and talking to elders about the evolution of the community. It's become clear to me, and I referenced it in my keynote yesterday, about how the educators are the revolutionaries. Um, and so that wasn't just to build people up who are working in education. I actually do honestly believe that, and I have a new perspective, and actually a stronger perspective on the importance of education and nation building, because I interviewed some people that were involved with what I'll be talking about here today, the development of the self-determining education institutions in Kahnawà, and really saw through their stories about their own journey and developing these things in the 70s and in the 80s, how education and nation building and the kind of agenda that Kahnawà has been known for in confronting colonialism and so forth are inextricably tied together. So the true revolutionaries not only are the people who stood on front lines of conflicts and did the kind of militant politics, but the people who gave them the ideas and the ideational framework and the values and the identity to be able to do whatever's necessary to protect their community and to defend their community from all the things that we've had to endure. And so I truly see the work that we do as educators as foundational to the resurgence of indigenous nationhood. And that's the context in Kahnawà. The larger context historically, just to give you a sense for those of you that have never been to or are not aware of Kahnawà. Kahnawà was a community that was formed as a Catholic community, as a religious center, a religion-centered community in the 1600s for people from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to ally themselves with the French and to practice Catholicism. That's the origins of that community. And the influence of the church was profound. And the influence of the church in terms of people's mentalities, the political organization, the governance of the community was very strong right up until the 1960s. And there's a couple of things that you need to understand about Kahnawà to understand anything about what we've done in self-determination and in education even, is that there was a process where most of our land was alienated from us in the 1950s because of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So the St. Lawrence Seaway is the shipping channel that's been built from the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic Ocean. And Kahnawà was the community affected most by this in the 1950s. So the governments of the United States and Canada came up with a plan to create a shipping lane, and it meant taking away the historic frontage of our community on the river. And Kahnawà in Mohawk means by the rapids. We're tied to the river in our identity and our culture and in the way of life that our people had up until that time. And then it was simply expropriated, taken away, houses moved, people moved off, and we were physically cut off from really the source of our identity and our culture, which was the riverfront and that life and the cultural life as a people who are oriented towards that. And that caused a major political and cultural shift in Kahnawà. It led to the rise of a traditionalist movement rejecting in very strong ways Canadian government authority, more so than in other places. It led to really a determination on the part of people to take charge and to not trust anymore, to not trust the church, to not trust the government, to not trust anybody for guaranteeing the future of our children other than ourselves. And I think that that's, in the short time we have, that's the context that I wanted to give you, is that the community beginning in the 1960s, because this process of expropriation and the violation of our rights and all the conflicts that came from that happened between 1957 and 1959. So beginning in the 1960s, literally 1960 onward, you have the rise of a whole bunch of different things happening in Kahnawà that led to this idea of self-determination that we embody today. And the movement happened in the context also of, for those that know Canadian, if you put your mind to Canadian history, Quebec nationalism as well. So you have this Mohawk nationalism, but you also at the very same time having the province of Quebec developing its own process of taking charge of its own institutions and really pushing an agenda of self-determination on their part. So you have this really contentious political environment where you have Mohawk and Quebec nationalism facing off against each other. And that's the context of the development of educational institutions in Kahnawà from the 1960s. The first thing that the people, so what I wanted to talk to you is about 3 examples of things that have happened in Kahnawà that are crucial, I think, to the experience of people living in Kahnawà, and I think instructive for other communities who are facing similar challenges. 3 lessons learned in our community through that experience, and then leave you with some of the challenges that we faced in Kahnawà that I think anybody working in education in any community can benefit from thinking through. So in the time that I have, I'm hoping to go through all of these things, and I'll lay it out for you. And if you have any questions, hopefully we'll have at least a few minutes where people can ask some questions. So the first thing I wanted to focus on is the Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee. So the Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee was an organization formed by parents in Kahnawà. And so given the history that I just outlined, where schooling was controlled by the churches, most of the school that we had Indian day school system in Kahnawà, and it was, most of the teachers were nuns and priests at a time, and then it developed into, there were lay teachers and so forth, but it was pretty much controlled exclusively by the church and by the Department of Indian Affairs. And in the era of the 1960s and 70s, when you had this rise of indigenous consciousness, you had the rise of Red Power movement, you had a traditionalist movement developing in the community, and you had just the kind of reaction to the control of the church generally in society. The parents in Kahnawà decided to take charge of education. And from talking to the people that were involved in that, it was a strong reaction to the parochialism of the school. There was a time in Kahnawà, and I think I was probably, I'm the age, I'm 57, maybe the last group of kids to come through schooling at the elementary levels where it was divided. So there was actually a division in the school, not only boys and girls, as was common at that time, but between Catholics and Longhouse people. it was divided physically, and so there was a reaction on the part of the mothers in that community and the parents in that community to say, how can we ever recover who we are? How can we ever educate our children to have the unity and the sense of self and identity as a Mohawk when we're allowing them to be divided in this way? So the schoolyard and the organization of the schools was seen as the foundation for, and I think correctly so, the identity formation that went into what it is to be a Kahnawà. And the parents decided to take charge of that. And so they formed the school committee, the Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee, where it was a unified approach to schooling, and they deparochialized. So they combined the schools. And so it was the really first, and this was in the early 1970s, it was really the first instance of putting children into schools and thinking about education in Kahnawà in a way which prioritized and organized around the idea of being a Mohawk as opposed to being a Catholic or a Protestant or someone who was a member of the Longhouse. And so I think that was crucial. And I'll talk about the lessons learned from this experience in a few minutes, but this is something which still continues to this day. The Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee is still the governing authority over education in Kahnawà. It's not the band council, and there's an educational administration that supports this, but the governance of education in Kahnawà is a committee with representation of people who are involved in post-secondary, people who have kids in elementary school, people who are part of the band system, people who are part of the traditional government. And so the idea that started in the 70s of a consensus of Kahnawà parents governing Kahnawà education still continues to this day. So that's one important feature of education in Kahnawà that I wanted to highlight. The next one is the example of the Indian Way School, as it's called, or Goriwanono, which is even before the formation of the Kahnawà Combined Schools Committee, you had the commitment on the part of people who had moved away from the colonial shaping of identity and colonial shaping of the community to reestablish longhouses in Kahnawà and to begin to practice a traditional lifestyle and traditional ceremonies and cultures, and really reinvigorate that element of who we are. And that movement started, I don't have time to talk about the history of the movement here, but it started in its resurgence in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, but really came to be the strongest feature of Kahnawà politics and culture beginning in the 1960s. Paralleling that, there was the formation of a school. And so there were some parents who were involved in the traditional movement in the Longhouse who opted to take their children out of the colonial system completely. And they formed their own school. And it was in the language, and it taught the history. And it was entirely parent funded and parent run. And they made that commitment on themselves to do that. And so the Indian Way School has always been kind of a proud, not kind of a proud feature of the community, but always kind of a high bar in terms of the community and what we're trying to do with education. It was completely self-determining. And so I think this level of dedication on the part of some parents and the representation of the idea of what it was to do education in a truly Mohawk way, fully and completely, was an important thing to have in the community. Over the years, and I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes in terms of the lessons, over the years it did get supported, and it did get recognition and so forth to where it got regularized and was able to kind of continue, although it faces its challenges. But that idea of a completely self-determining act in the area of education was important for leading the movement in Kahnawà in terms of education. The other one, and this one is more well-known, is at the secondary level in terms of the Kahnawà Survival School. So the Kahnawà Survival School is another instance of the community reacting to the continuing determination of educational priorities by outside governments and outside people. And so up until the 1970s, late 70s, in spite of the controls in the community at the elementary level, everyone had to go to high school if you chose to go to high school outside of the community. So the town next door is called Chateauguay, and there's a school there, Howard-S. Billings, and everybody went to school there. But if you recall in Canadian history in Quebec, because of the nationalist movement in Quebec, you had Bill 101 right at the end of the 70s. It developed, and they imposed it in 1980. And so the Quebec government attempted to force students in Howard-S. Billings High School who were from Kahnawà to take part in that system of having to qualify to go to school in English. And the perception was there that Mohawk students would have to be educated in French. And people reacted to that on one level in terms of being told which language of instruction, even though there were two colonial languages. But I think it struck and brought a deeper challenge to the community in the sense that why are we in other people's schools having to play by their rules? And this is driven again by parents, but importantly here, in this case, in KSS, by students too, who were dissatisfied with their experience. And so they organized a walkout. It still amazes people in the community to think that they simply withdrew their kids from schools and formed their own high school over the course of a few months, and began a community-wide effort to begin to teach these kids and to draw teachers and to set up classrooms. And it began a process of actually establishing a high school in the community, which is now a full-fledged high school, funded buildings and programs and so forth. And so I apologize for kind of skipping over the history of this, but I wanted to give you the context of the kind of things that have been done in Kahnawà, and then move to the lessons that have been learned so that we can kind of discuss and think through this. The lessons that have been learned in Kahnawà, if you want to talk about, and first of all, I see Mike's on now, and a lot of this parallels Akwesasne too, you know, so they have the Freedom School and the similar movements and ideas. And so I really think it's kind of a Mohawk approach. I'm talking about Kahnawà, but I think it's a Mohawk approach. And I mean, I know Kahnawà and Akwesasne, and I think that there's a lot of parallels and similarities in terms of the mentality that goes into confronting these challenges. And so the outcomes are pretty similar as well. And the lessons that we've learned is that if you want to do education for decolonization, it has to be parent driven. So in Kahnawà, all of these movements were driven by the parents' desire and commitment and dedication to see their children educated, not for colonial objectives, but for the objective that support the rise of the Mohawk Nation, the reunification of our people, and the reconnection of our people to our culture and to our land. That's the first lesson. So it's not the chiefs and council, it's not experts, it's not the educational administrators. All of these people serve the drive of the parents who have come to a consensus about what's needed in the community. So that's lesson one in Kahnawà. Lesson two is, as it's said in Kahnawà, it's kind of like a just do it philosophy, or a just do it strategy. They don't negotiate with the government for reforms. They don't sit down and lay out an agenda and try to get the funding and the negotiation and the recognition of that. They do it first, driven by community energy and the practical skills and the commitments on the part of the community, whether it's the KCSC, the Indian Way School, or the Kahnawà Survival School. They do it first, and then they go and try to negotiate recognition. And then they push for recognition, they push for funding. In some cases, it takes years. I mean, outside the educational milieu, they took that approach. They took that approach with the peacekeepers in our police force, and it took 15 years to get recognition. But it's the same thing here, say with the Kahnawà Survival School. The third important lesson is how important this is in terms of the identity formation of Mohawks and the long-term process of recovering from the colonial divisions, teaching our children our history from our perspective, restoring the language and so forth has always been the #1 priority. And in terms of challenges that flow from this approach, it's not without it. Parental commitment. This approach takes a lot of commitment on the part of parents. When you're talking about the survival school, the freedom school in Akwesasne, it's parent driven, but it's also parent supported. And that, of course, you know, given the energy that it takes and so forth is a challenge in a lot of cases. In Kahnawà, actually, there's another challenge, which is getting parents to support these initiatives by sending their kids to these schools, because of course they have the option of sending them to Montreal. They have the option of sending them to the regular school system. And a lot of people still think through this in terms of jobs and opportunities, as opposed to identity formation and the nation building aspect of it. So this is a real challenge to keep people in line, thinking in terms of the value of this thing. The other thing is the contentiousness with government and doing it this way, and always being in a kind of contentious relationship with the government institutions as opposed to being in a cooperative one. maintenance of consensus. There have been instances where educational administrators have chosen to focus on developing innovation and capacity in the system and have brought in outside expertise or even outside leadership. And the KCSS has really responded to that in a strong way. And there have been conflicts in the community over the nation building priority versus developing capacity in the Western sense or a more technical or academic sense. I think I'll leave it at that because we don't have that much time, and I could talk about this for a long time, but I wanted to lay out these things here and look forward to hearing what people have to say and following on the discussion that comes next. Now I'll go.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, because they're unique and different, and because it's the experience within your community. A quick question in terms of the passing it on from parent to parent and you know, younger parents. Our younger parents, because they've been through this system 60, 70, 80 now for, you know, 20, 30 years, do parents automatically or I mean, there must be a balance within your school system so that they can function in both Western way and a traditional way.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of support. It's great support in the community for the system and the options that are available. It's actually developed more than I indicated in my sort of presentation of it, because the parents in Kahnawà now have the opportunity to send their kids to school completely in Mohawk and immersion. They have the option to go a second route, which is a hybrid model, you know, English and Mohawk, and they also have an option of French and English or French and Mohawk. And so they have a lot of options. And I think that what you find in a community, also Kahnawà is a fairly large community, you know, there's around 10,000 people that are members there. And so you have parents, as you would imagine, with different goals. You know, some parents, because of their own goals, want their kids to be fluent in French and are very oriented towards job skills. And they tend to prioritize going outside. People in the community who are oriented towards just the objectives of nationhood and cultural resurgence and so forth, they tend to be the ones that send their kids to the Kahnawà Survival School. There's not that much differentiation at the elementary level. Almost everybody sends their kids to school in Kahnawà at the elementary level. It's at the secondary level when it comes time to choose to where to send your kid to high school, that there's a lot of differentiation there, and you really see the influence of parental goals there.
Okay. And how has it impacted the youth in terms of feeling confident, knowing who they are and knowing their language? I mean, if they finish elementary school, they're speaking their language, yes? Well,
all I can say is that I can give two examples. You know, we can talk about it theoretically, but I can say that our new Grand Chief in the elected system was raised in the Longhouse. She was educated in Kahnawà. In this system, she's a language speaker, and so forth. And I am impressed not only by the rootedness in the culture and the person there, but also the ability to kind of engage with the needs as they present themselves from outside. You know, there's a criticism of, well, if you're going to do this, you're going to suffer because you're not as skilled or you don't have the benefits of the Western education in terms of science and math and all those things. But that's not been the case in terms of creating confidence and creating capacity and creating a strong identity to take charge of the future and so forth. She's our Grand Chief now. And I'll also give another example. My assistant in the work that I do in Kahnawà for the last 2 years, 29-year-old woman who went through this whole process here and schooled in Kahnawà. She was my project assistant in the governance work that I'm doing in Kahnawà. She ran for council and now she's my boss. And I see these two people that went through this system, and I see no deficits in terms of their training and capacities. And so I'm a strong supporter, even though I don't, I live in BC, and I'm making my transition back to Kahnawà. So my kids are educated in BC here where their mother is. But I would definitely support, and I would be one that made the choice to send my kids to school in Kahnawà, given the experience that I have with these, with a number of people, but especially these two people that I have a very close working relationship with.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and really important words to hear. And I know someone in the chat room, I know we don't have time to deal with it now, was wondering what lessons could be taken away from a community approach to influence colonial education in institutions, something to think about. So thank you for the question. But I now would like to introduce Mike Mitchell. I have worked with him for a while now, and he is, I don't think there's a need for introduction. We had one yesterday and today, and I'd really rather him have 20 minutes, 25 minutes before we have to move to the session at 12 o'clock. So Mike, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
If we want to talk about decolonizing, I want to talk about my time as a leader in a community. And it started back in the late 70s, early 80s, all the way through to 2015. And at the time that I started getting involved in community affairs, we still had an Indian agent who chaired the meetings of the Band Council. And they spoke a certain language that kind of fits into what we're talking about. If I describe my community in Akwesasne, they were known back then as St. Regis Reserve, St. Regis Band Council, St. Regis Tribe, and so on. And that's who they thought of themselves over time, over history, that's who they are. And if you go on the American side of Akwesasne, they would say, we're tribe, we're the St. Regis tribe. We're New York State Indians, that's what was common over there. On the Canadian side, they would say, we're Indianac Indians, and we are the St. Regis Band. We are the St. Regis Band Council. Band programs, we have a band administrator. You see, it was ingrained in their minds that define who they are. And this is over time established subliminal by Indian Affairs, Canadian government, the provinces, and they say, this is going to be the way we're going to relate to you. And as far as division, the traditional people were also in there. They were a smaller group. They maintained their traditional ceremonies. They believed that they were part of a nation. And that's basically where I came in from. So when I got involved in the elected politics, it wasn't an easy introduction, to say the least. It was rough because most of the people that were in the system already believed themselves to be one type. And my belief in nationhood, traditionalism didn't fit with the mindset at the time. So the whole idea was Indian Affairs runs the community through its system. If you want to talk about education, then the Band Council would bring in a person from Indian Affairs from the Indian Affairs region in Toronto. If you want to talk about housing, somebody else would come in, an official from Indian Affairs. So there was a whole army of Indian Affairs people, executives, officials that would come in. They would take a report and defining the need, and they would determine how much money is needed and so on. Well, by the early 1980s, the community was just about close to receiving third-party management, and they were blaming the council and the community for misspending, etc. But in reality, it was the Indian Affairs staff that, through the confusion of how they administered. So that was quite the introduction for me. I came from the traditional side. My upbringing, raised in part by my grandparents and parents in a longhouse in ceremony. And because I operated a cultural center in a community that appealed to all segments, they encouraged me to think about maybe running for elected council. And I became Grand Chief in 1984. I was introduced as a district chief for the elected council, band council, back in 78. So from that period on, other than a few times that I stopped being the Grand Chief and went back to district chief to give another person the opportunity to have a taste of what it's like to be at the helm, mostly involved in the politics. I shared this story with you because the rough part about how we view ourselves as a people, the fact that I'll start with being referred to as a band and how it's ingrained in from the colonial system. We had a band administrator, we operated band programs, and so the word band, we're a band community. Everything that we said and everything that we did was because we are part of a band. And we're under the Indian Act. And so my introduction to the elected system, the word was almost like a swear word. And it was the cause of the division amongst ourselves. And one of the first things I did in my role as Grand Chief was to say, we're not going to use that word anymore because it's demeaning. We obviously are not a band. We don't play rock and roll, and we're not a rubber band, and I don't know whatever else is definition, but we're not a band. We are part of a nation. So the mindset had to be changed. And we stopped referring to as a band, band reserve, band council, and we changed the name from St. Regis Band Council to Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. That's just being consistent with Kahnawà. We were going through this together, and Kahnawà that they all changed their name to the Mohawk Council. And Taiaiake came afterwards. And there was a movement in the 1980s to try to recapture the spirit and pride of nation building and try to take away the shackles of the Indian Act, Indian Affairs. So in Akwesasne, I asked the Minister of Indian Affairs if I have a formula to wipe out the deficit that have been occurred over so many years, then I would ask the minister to withdraw all his staff from Indian Affairs and let us run our own community. And in education, within that first year, we started up our own school board and had our own people elected to sit on the school board and make decisions on hiring, curriculum, cultural content, etc. It affected other entities in our community. Policing, police commission, the justice department was created, lawmaking was done through the community, and this whole nation idea affected one level to another level in the community where the mindset changed. We convinced ourselves that we truly were seemingly being puppets of Indian Affairs. We controlled the attitude of the people, the attitude of defining who we are. And the goal for us was to change that attitude. And one of the first things that I had initiated in our council meetings, made up of individuals who made up the band council, was not to use the word band council anymore. And I put a coffee cup in the middle of the meeting boardroom table. And I said, let's make a game of it. Any chief, any counselor, because they were called counselors at that time, any counselor that uses the word band council, band programs, he's going to drop a quarter into that cup. And everybody laughed. They says, well, that's a simple game. But in reality, we built up quite a hefty coffee fund after 2 weeks. And people laughed because we kept getting caught. We didn't realize how many times we referred to ourselves as a band community. And so the determination of not using it anymore and replacing it with either community or nation concept, and think different of ourselves, think more Okwesasne. And so it reflected in a community that gave the new Board of Education the mindset that they could make decisions for the community, make the education more adaptable to our culture and history, put pride back, and to move forward. All the institutions under the band council was now in community to participate, to be part of it. So we had a police commission, justice commission. Many elements of the community began to change. And we thought better of ourselves. The attachments to Indian affairs and their decision-making over us had changed. And we grew. And the other thing that changed very early was how we view ourselves as a Wet'suwet'en. And this started, how do I say this with great care? Because the Pope came to Canada in 1984. And because I was Loungehouse traditional, it didn't sit well with some of the community members who were very strong Christian Catholics. So I had a rough ride in the first couple of months. Offices occupied, get beat up going to work, getting beat up coming from work. It was rough at the beginning. And when the Pope announced that he was coming to Canada, he asked the bishops of Canada if they could find somebody to do a healing ceremony for him. He said he wanted to experience what Indigenous people believed in. So the call came into the local priest in the village, in the church, and he came and he said they want to know if we had a ceremony, a traditional kind. I told him we just elected a pagan from the Longhouse. He's a faith keeper. He must know something about ceremony. I said, well, tell him I'll go back to the Longhouse, to the chiefs and clan mothers, and I'll ask them. All in all, after a little bit of back and forth, they said, do it. And we notified the Vatican that I would be part of a traditional ceremony, a healing ceremony, that we would do it for the Pope. And this occurred in Midland, Ontario, in, I believe, in June or July of '84. Up until then, because I was new in the position, the division between the RC as a strong community and the traditionals kind of like very one-sided, and the viewpoints reflected that. So it was quite of an enlightening lesson for all of us. We were allowed to do our ceremonial songs for him. Other from the Ojibwe and Cree Nations of Ontario were with us. So we smudged, we offered sacred tobacco, we sang our ceremonial songs, and all that time facing him. And he was overtaken by the ceremony, by the way the ceremony was conducted. And right towards the end, I'm standing only a few feet from him. I could see tears coming down his cheek. And when he got done, it was his turn to address. By the way, there was 50, 60,000 people in this field in Midland. So when he got up to speak, they give him his speaking papers, but he kind of put that aside. And here's what he talked about. I want to say to everyone, he said that I have found in my experience that the indigenous people of the Americas are very spiritual people. And for what we have done throughout the years of making them into something else, believe their spirituality in their own culture and traditions are as close to the Creator as anybody else, as any other religion. And I want to ask all the Catholic indigenous people to honor and maintain that culture, maintain your language, maintain your ceremonies, and make it part of the church as much as possible. He says, we need to help protect what belongs to them and how they define themselves as indigenous people. That pretty well defined the future relationship, the hostility towards traditional values, customs ended, and more Christian people began to take notice of their culture, of their language, and it kind of turned around. And it affected politically and otherwise as well. We thought better of ourselves. We didn't shrink away from any traditional ceremony. As a matter of fact, an outreach by the church to have ceremonies take place within the church, smudging, tobacco burning, and that led up to today. We as a community think better of ourselves, stronger in being aware of who we are. I tell this story because it's a very short time period, and it took 200-300 years of changing that mindset and thinking less of ourselves, less of our language, of our custom, of our spirituality, and pushing it off to the side and trying to replace it with something else. What the Pope at that time, Pope John Paul, advocated is that this is very necessary to be who you are as indigenous people, your culture, your tradition, your ceremonies, and being closer to the Creator in your own way, equally as important as anything else. And he advocated, he said, I want you to consider having strong ties to your culture. That really helped me survive in politics. And it also helped the community in thinking stronger, embedded in their culture. That's a story that I want to tell in terms of colonialism, because the same held true in politics, is that inner affairs had power over the council, over decision-making. I come from a time period where the last Indian agent left shortly after I got there, and the whole nation building process began. Defining who we are as a community, defining how we looked at ourselves, that it's not bad to put on traditional calls or speak your language, and it reflected in our teaching institutions. Language was always important in Akwesasne. So currently we have 1 or 2, maybe 3 residential schools in the community. Immersion schools started in 1977, I believe, with the Akwesasne Freedom School. And again, it's just like a previous speaker talked about Kahnawà, Gerald Alfred, and saying they started a Mohawk immersion school. Ours was the Freedom School. And there were great parallels. Putting pride back in a community by reflecting strongly in defining who we are for ourselves. Well, politically, it led to reasserting ourselves as a people, as a Oklahoma, and it reflected in our education institutions, socially, health-wise. We incorporate traditional medicine in our health center. That also incorporated ceremonial parts, having feasts to honor ancestors, doing away with the negative aspects of colonialism that said, no, that's not progress. and reshaping and redefining closer ties to our culture. As the community got stronger, we thought less and less of Indian agent, Indian affairs, and doing more for ourselves. Yes, there was border problems and relations with Quebec, because 2/3 of what is in Canada, Akwesasne, is in the province of Quebec, which made it more of a partnership and companion with Kahnawà and Kahnawà in things that we did. We fought together against Ottawa, against Quebec, and that drew our communities together. I want to end on, this is a very fast travel that I'm taking you on. Over last weekend, we did a medicine cross game in Kahnawà. It's a very ancient game. It requires people that are one another in their community to sit, celebrate, and stone of an ancient game that had set a feast in it, and it brought people back together. We're going to probably doing more of it, sometimes bringing your people back together under your own, celebrated. And so that's the path that we're on, is take the shackles of outside influences and put more into your culture. And it's been my experience that this is a very important element in how we define ourselves. And so I'll leave it there, and I'll take any questions you may have. I'm just looking at the time. I'm very close to the end of what I've been asked to do by way of presentation.
Well, now go, Mike. Thank you for those words. These are words that resonate because they are steps taken by the people, for the people, before it was timely. And it has now put you in an amazing place, Kahnawà and Akwesasne, as leaders in self-determining for yourselves education and taking nationhood and practicing it on a daily basis. And I think that communities, other Indian Act communities, and all others, and especially non-Indigenous peoples, I think need to hear these amazing stories. And that's why we were wanting this specific session, because I think that you have done that in such a passionate way, and in a way that shows love, caring for your community. And I think, and for your people, and for all, for the 7 generations yet to come, all of those little babies yet to come, they'll have a better place to learn and be who they are. And that's what we want. We want to live in our First Nation communities in the way that is traditional, that is a way that supports our languages. And so thank you so much for sharing. It really helps us. It really makes us believe we're on the right path in supporting our First Nations administrators and knowing how crucial, we're at that crucial point in time where we all now have to stand up and take these steps that are never easy steps. Change is never easy, as I've said forever.